Hi, good morning and welcome to today's session with the HR World. My name is Sarah Rice. I am editor of the HR World, which is the UK's newest, freshest news and views and HR networking platform. We are very lucky to be joined today in the session with Anna Elliott. Hi, Anna.
Hello, Sarah. Hi, everyone.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Great. It's so nice to see you. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into the session today. I just wondered, could you let us all know a little bit about yourself and the practice in particular?
Yes, thanks, Sarah, and great to be speaking with you all this morning on such a topical and interesting issue. Just a bit about myself. I'm an employment partner at Osborne Clarke, which is a leading international employment law firm. I lead the Bristol employment team, and I'm also the UK lead for the retail and consumer sector. My practice covers a broad range of employment issues, ranging from day-to-day strategic and general employment advice to HR and legal teams, also employment litigation and the employment aspects of corporate transactions. But I do have also a particular focus on restrictive covenants and discrimination and harassment issues, which is where a lot of these reputational risks lie, which is why I'm so interested in this topic as well, Sarah.
Brilliant. Yes, and this, Anna, we're very lucky because Anna is our resident legal expert, so we always feel that we're in safe hands when it comes to employment law. And in fact, Anna does a column, a monthly column for the HR World. And actually, this conversation came out of, I'm obsessed with this story and the fact that it's, you know, it kind of blew up out of nowhere and just has flagged up so many different issues for the company. And we were talking about it, weren't we, about how, you know, and I'd never, up until this moment, we hadn't really covered that much actually on the HR World around how HR is really one of the gatekeepers of a business's reputation, and specifically, obviously, around the people management aspect. I mean, with the P&O story in particular, obviously, it broke on March 17th. Nearly 800 people were made redundant on an online announcement, with the view that the move had to be made to save the business that was the P&O Ferries has been going through a very difficult time. Now, we cannot, and it's very important to say this, we cannot know what went on behind those closed doors. All we have is the stories that were reported. Of course, the, if you like, irony of this sort of the move and the way that it was done meant that the business itself has suffered massively over the last 7 weeks. And I think we'd like to say we've aligned this webinar with the fact that they have just started sailing again, but I believe the Spirit of Britain took to the channel yesterday to go across the English Channel from the UK to France for the first time. So yeah, so we're not kind of, you know, we're not going to be looking specifically into what actually happened around the P&O situation itself, but it does absolutely flag, Anna, doesn't it, the sort of the widespread issues that HR has to deal with on a daily basis almost. But obviously, when these big crisis moments happen, you know, HR is called in to take the lead in these situations. And I guess what would be the normal process that you would expect HR teams to kind of undertake in a situation like this?
So yeah, thanks, Sarah. It does really throw out some interesting issues, and as I said, I can't really comment on the particular issue that happened there because we don't know the facts and what was involved. But I think the normal situation is from a HR team perspective is you would want them to be quite involved early on in any business decision, and obviously there's a lot of change happening for businesses at the moment and things that they have to deal with, but it's really getting that early involvement by HR teams so that they can understand the rationale for a business's decision, and also that you've got sufficient time to plan any processes in terms of dealing with employees to make sure that you are complying with, for example, collective consultation requirements in this case, and in others. So you've got early upfront involvement. You can also coach managers in terms of how they're delivering decisions, because a lot of claims can be minimised in terms of how they're presented and how you're communicating with employees. So it really is important that I think HR teams have as much early involvement as possible so they can take a proactive approach to managing reputational risks and foreseeing where potential issues could arise, and then engaging with others in the business as required, and including potentially external PR consultants to just try and deal with any reputational risk that may arise from implementing a decision that affects employees.
I mean, there's a lot in there, isn't there, to kind of unpack. And I guess in a very fast-moving environment, HR is kind of, is having to make, along with the rest of the leadership team, having to make really quite significant decisions on the go. And in fact, we actually have a survey that we are going to set live just to get a steer on where our wonderful attendees today kind of sit on the issue around, have you ever been in these sort of situations, and if so, what kind of what kind of background did you have to deal with, and did it have a significant kind of impact on the business? So I'm here supported today by the lovely Alex, who's going to, I believe, set the survey live. And we're just going to take a moment to let you answer that. So hopefully we can get you involved. And obviously we're going to feed back those responses to you as we can. Oh, it's already in the chat. Brilliant. We've got a new IT setup today, so we're all over ourselves. So that's brilliant. So it should be in the chat. So please do fill that in. And I cannot emphasize enough how much we want to hear from you today. So please do ask questions, and Alex will be moderating them, and we will keep an eye on them as we're going and address at the end when we have our Q&A. So in terms of one of the things that obviously has kind of, again, P&O kind of flagged up was the role of leadership in the overall business decision making, and I believe the CEO of P&O has taken has obviously taken the step to make that announcement online, and as a result his name has been all over the papers, and obviously there's a lot of controversy around the decision. How, what's the kind of, from an HR perspective and from a legal perspective, in terms of putting somebody in that role and kind of making those moves, what would you have expected to have seen that kind of look like? How would you, the best practice in terms of getting a business to that stage to sort of make a decision like that?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because it really does depend on the particular business and the way it's run operationally in terms of who's delivering decisions like that. Obviously, with a huge entity, you'd expect there to be, a large, sophisticated HR team, but other management teams and layers in terms of how you get to making a decision that can affect a large swathe of employees. So you'd expect there to be quite a lot of process involved in terms of coming to a decision and how that is delivered. Obviously, it's up to the business as to the reasons in which they are complying with employment law, but you would hope that some consideration is had around that and what are the potential ramifications for the business, not only from an employment claims perspective, but also from a risk management exercise, but also thinking carefully about employee relations and how it's going to impact the remaining employees who are not impacting by decisions. So I think within any business, depending on its size, you would hope that a leader is being mindful of the ramifications of the outcomes of any decision, not only reputationally, but also in terms of legal claims too. Yeah,
I mean, that's again, it's interesting in this sector because it's quite a highly unionized environment, isn't it? And one of the things that we talked about previously also is then kind of being mindful of how you engage with the unions across the piece. And I think it's, the UK now has got quite a varied union unionized scenario, doesn't it? But it definitely sort of gave the unions the opportunity to kind of definitely make a stand on this issue. What do you see on a daily basis in terms of HR navigating redundancies? What do you think are the biggest sort of pitfalls to watch out for?
Well, one of the pitfalls to watch out for is, first of all, making sure that you're complying with your redundancy obligations in terms of consultation processes. And that process will vary largely depending on the number of employees that are affected by the redundancy within a 90-day period. So where you have a mass redundancy, like in this scenario we're talking about, then you would need to engage with the unions if there is a recognised union in place as authorised and appointed representatives to help with the consultation process. So that process would need to take place in good time, but within 45 days of the first dismissal taking place. So the unions will need to be engaged in a collective consultation process if they are recognised within the business. If not, then it'll need to be appointed employee representatives by the affected group of employees who will be impacted by the decision. So there is a large part to play in a mass redundancy scenario if there is a recognised union, that you'll need to engage with them as part of the consultation process. So from a HR team's perspective, it will be important that you've got the relationship with that union, and I think ensuring that they have an early acknowledgement of what's going on and that they really understand the business rationale, because that will hopefully help smooth the process if they understand why the decision is being taken, and that can be worthwhile. Often it really does depend on the type of union, but also with the union rep and the approach they take, and having a relationship with them to really bring them on board into the process. Obviously they're going to defend their members as best they can, but I think it's really important to make sure that you get their early involvement, and so that they really understand the process, and that you're trying to do the right thing in terms of implementing it. It's sometimes a tough business decision.
Yes, and I think that kind of comes down to the crux of the P&O story itself, but also what I would imagine a lot of HR teams are facing at the moment, in the sense that we've just come through an incredibly tumultuous period from a business perspective, from a people perspective. You know, in this specific situation, P&O were looking at, you know, making this decision because of the problems that we're facing over, you know, higher fuel costs, the lack of people, you know, the less people. I think P&O have been around for 3 decades or more, you know, and they were set up in a pre-cheap flights era. You know, the kind of the actual consumer behaviours themselves have changed so radically, even pre-pandemic. Add in a pandemic, add in Brexit. You know, you've got a very volatile situation there in terms of, you know, where an organisation like P&O would have expected to have been, say, 5 years ago, and in fact it's shown that, you know, that is the case, is that the business was kind of suffering. So, you know, you've got to have some sympathy, I guess, in the sense, from a business perspective, is you're having to make pretty difficult decisions. Is that what you're hearing from other HR contacts and businesses, that, you know, there's quite a lot of unexpected churn, if you like, or difficulty in the markets, that people are having to get their heads around and make decisions quite quickly?
Yes, and they have had to over the last few years as well. I mean, I think the pandemic has really shown how quickly HR needs to react, but also the business as well. And if I take that example, 2 years ago, we were advising so many clients on very quick fire decisions they were going to have to take to really make sure they're preserving costs and keeping the business going through a very difficult time where people couldn't work. So that was a prime example of where HR was really at the coalface in terms of dealing with a very unprecedented situation, and implementing decisions very quickly in terms of furloughing staff and other steps that needed to be made. And likewise, we've seen redundancy and, you know, restructuring exercises that have had to happen since then, to make sure that businesses remain viable and can keep going. So it's really been a very difficult period, and I think it's shown the pivotal role that HR plays in terms of implementing difficult decisions very quickly. And I think it's really important that, you know, HR teams do stay close to the business stakeholders as much as possible, so they have early involvement in the decisions, and to ensure they have as much notice as possible to be proactive and manage the decisions and implementation of them quickly and sensitively, being mindful of employment claims. So yeah, it's a difficult place to be, but you know, I think from lots of the HR teams I've spoken with, you know, that's been a really important point to really make sure that they're staying close to the stakeholders and that they can, yeah, be prepared as possible in terms of implementation.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I know, that speaking to a lot of HR people, that being the idea of being close to the business is absolutely pivotal to lots of different kinds of decisions. And I guess, I mean, what, you know, in terms of some of the employment claims situations that you've seen in the past, where, you know, what are the kind of most common problems that are kind of being thrown up?
In terms of reputational risk, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. It really ranges. It's very interesting. So I mentioned at the outset, often with discrimination, harassment claims, we've seen a lot of reputational issues around that. I mean, we've all seen plenty of news stories around leaders within businesses or other systemic issues of discrimination and harassment. And I think that really does give rise to a, you know, very potential and serious reputational risk issues that we've seen, you know, following the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, and businesses really having to take a stance in terms of how they are responding to such issues. And obviously there's the ensuing potential employment claims, but it's really, you know, the reputational risk and the impact on share price that we've seen an impact on. I won't name the businesses, but I'm sure you can think of a few as I speak. So I think that's one area that's been a bit of a hotbed in terms of potential reputational risk and dealing with those proactively. And obviously we've seen businesses responding to that to try and prevent those issues, for example, through policies, training, working with line managers, and putting other things in place to really reduce those risks arising. But certainly I've worked on cases where there's been some really serious misconduct issues happening, for example, with one well-known media company. As an external legal advisor, we had to work very closely with the PR consultant in terms of press releases and the stance the business took in dealing with those issues to really help reduce the reputational risks and damage around those issues, and also advising on social media policies and what other employees were commenting on in relation to issues. So I've definitely seen it in discrimination and harassment scenarios, but actually more recently I've seen it with, you know, disgruntled job candidates who have been refused an offer of a role, and they weren't happy with that, assumed it was discriminatory. They've written to the CEO, they've threatened to go to shareholders, they've said, I'm going to bring an employment tribunal claim and I'm going to invite the press along to the hearing. So whether that's a threat just to get a settlement, who knows, but you know, we are certainly seeing employees being very savvy in terms of their use and reliance on potential reputational risks in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I mean, my background is as a journalist and then someone who went into PR, so I've kind of had, you know, I bring a little bit of that today as well, and it is really interesting that in this period of mass, you know, this stage of mass media, that we have access to so many different communication channels, and that brands are very much out there and having to engage to improve their reputation. That obviously that means that people have an opportunity to raise these issues in a public forum that potentially they didn't have before. Again, looking at kind of this situation done in a very specific way, a very short time frame, it feels that they had to make that decision fairly quickly. I know that the statement that was put out from P&O was literally, we're asking people to get off the boat and we won't be taking the boats out for the rest of for the, you know, the foreseeable future. So in terms of, I mean, I know from my own experience in crisis communications that didn't feel like it potentially was a very drawn out experience, that they were expecting this kind of, you know, to happen at a particular stage. And how, you know, I look at it from a professional perspective and have many questions that I know we can't answer today, but from a communications perspective, it does seem to have opened the door, if you like, for reputational damage. And I guess from your perspective, and I haven't worked with Osborne Clarke, but I've worked with a lot of different legal teams over the years in supporting the message and how a communications plan can be put together around these things. I mean, can we talk a little bit about the consultation process in this? Because it feels to me that that is kind of central to everything that you're saying, whether it's, you know, dealing with unions, dealing with the public, dealing with obviously the members of staff that are going to be affected. I mean, what do you see as really the best way possible to go around that specific process?
Well, in terms of that specific process where you have a mass redundancy exercise and more than 99 employees are affected, there is a very well-defined process that you would need to go through. Firstly, there's the formal notification to the Secretary of State, which must be made within 45 days before the first dismissal takes effect. Employees can't be given notice of dismissal without that, so that's got a potential criminal impact, so that's pretty significant. Secondly, you'll need to make sure that you've gone through a collective consultation process, which I said before will involve consulting with the unions as the appointed representatives, if there is a union, if not, with the relevant employee representatives who will need to be engaged with. That consultation needs to take place in good time, but in any event within at least 45 days before the first dismissal takes effect. In tandem with the collective consultation, there'll also need to be individual consultation where employers will need to look at reasonable alternative roles. You need to look at selection pools and making sure that you're not unlawfully selecting people or being tripped up by automatic unfair dismissal because of certain selecting people who have certain characteristics or rights. You also need to look at, as I said, the alternatives to making those redundancies to make sure the dismissal isn't unfair. And lastly, if employees have more than 2 years service, then you need to make sure they're given a statement confirming true and adequate reasons for their dismissal, and non-compliance can result in a claim of up to 2 weeks pay. So that's a very high level summary of the process,
Sure.
but as you can see, it is quite involved. And obviously with this decision, it appears that that process wasn't gone into. I mean, my first reaction was, well, are the employees governed by English law anyway, or is there another reason, or is there a business reason that had to override complying with that process? I mean, it's difficult for us to speculate and comment on, but as you can see, I mean, that's just one example of a process where it is quite involved in terms of implementing a decision affecting employees.
And at what stage in that process would you expect the communications people to be involved? From a brand perspective, P&O Ferries is without doubt one of Britain's greatest known brands. It's traditionally been trusted to ferry people across the channel. I mean, it has been around for a long time, and I think from a brand perspective, who do you think is the best, at what time rather do you think the brand and communications people should be brought in to advise on some of those consultation matters?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's difficult to know in a particular situation at what stage without knowing all the background facts and the advice.
I would always say given. Right at the beginning, Anna. I would always say that.
No, but it does depend on the particular situation. So if we're talking small scale redundancies affecting a handful of employees, then they may not be involved at all because that's just managed in a contained way, is unlikely to go public. Where you have a decision that is likely to go public, I agree, you would involve them as early as possible in the process to make sure you're dealing with this from a risk management perspective rather than from a crisis management perspective after the effect and once something's
it's the difference, isn't it? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it can become from what can go from fairly straightforward, well, not fairly straightforward, but a risk assessment to a crisis management program. It can turn like that, can't it? So,
yeah, and you don't want to be on the other side of it, not having thought out a plan in terms of how you're responding. But often you would be engaging early to make sure, well, how can we actually contain potential reputational risks here? Do we have the right confidentiality provisions in place in employment contracts? Do we have a robust social media policy as to what employees within the business can say? Just making sure you've got that infrastructure and protection around the business to try and contain any potential.
And it feels right now where employer brand in particular is so important. The jobs market, for want of a better word, is a bit nuts. It's there's a huge amount of flux out there, and people are really choosing very carefully who to work for. And so employer brand in a sense is becoming as, if not more than, important than the consumer brand in some cases, and particularly in high churn environments like hospitality and kind of leisure. So, I mean, again, I think that kind of has to come into play here, in the sense that what we're seeing is potential long-term damage to people not just wanting to take. I know a lot of people are taking a value call on whether they even go on the ferry with P&O, but also whether they would want to work for them long term. So it does seem that the decisions in terms of how people are treating their staff in the first place around these issues will go on to inform hiring strategies down the line.
Yes, certainly, and I think lots of potential employees are looking at various review websites for businesses generally, and forming a view in terms of what former employees say. And as you say, it's a really tight market at the moment, so employer brand is increasingly important and being factored into reasons for joining organisations, you know, in terms of what the culture is like and how they treat their employees, and other issues as well. But even investors, for example, we've seen around discussions of ESG, the S within that being the social aspects and how you're treating employees, it is also becoming important to investors in terms of the decisions that they're making to invest. So I think it's, you know, factoring in a number of ways.
Yeah, it's like, you know, people don't just have access anymore to the brand on social media or the media. They actually can find who the shareholders are and the investors are to put pressure on them directly in some cases, can't they?
Well,
right, shall we?
yes,
sorry,
yeah.
I was going to say,
in terms of that candidate example I mentioned, that definitely happened
exactly.
there.
Yeah, we're like rattling the cage. So, should we have a little look at our survey responses?
Sure.
So we've got a 5 out of basically 4.5 stars out of 5, saying on the question, on a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think HR's role is when it comes to business reputation? So universally, we're saying it is pretty important, which is probably to be expected, but great to see that is part of the thinking. And we have seen that most people have experienced, and I'm presuming that everybody here is working in HR or directly related to an HR solution. So have you had to deal with any issues that have potentially damaged business reputation? And redundancy has come out on top of that, but also letting people go is a big issue. And after that, actually disciplinary and court cases have come up as well. So I should imagine they're probably linked to those two things. Interestingly, only 3 of our respondents have said they've had problems with their employees on social media, which, having worked for some big brands in the UK, is surprising to me, because we had to spend quite a lot of time sometimes fielding those issues. And yes, if you did experience it, did it have negative consequences for the business? So one of this is an anonymous survey, so we're not naming any names at all. But one of somebody said, managed to contain the situation, but it had the potential to cause problems. Senior level pushing HR down a route they shouldn't be going. I mean, is that something that you find once you get into some cases that are problematic, that there is a sort of a conflict within some of the senior teams?
Yes, absolutely. And I was advising on an issue recently to do with dismissing the managing director of a business, and the chair and the board had a view on actually that needed to happen very quickly, because the impact on the wider business of letting them stay was resulting in resignations, and actually was causing wider systemic issues across the business. It was a high risk dismissal because there were live claims that the MD was already agitating. I provided advice to the in-house lawyer and the head of HR on the legal consequences of that, and they completely understood those reasons and were fully aware of the risks going into it, but nonetheless they had to implement the board's decision to dismiss that person, because actually the reputational risk within the culture of the business, the loss of other potential employees due to the actions of this managing director, overrode the potential ramifications in terms of legal claims. So there are decisions where commercially you just have to make that choice, but from a HR legal perspective, it may carry risk. But you know, commercially that's what
And
the
it can
business
be
needs
quite
to do.
terrifying, I should imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So all you can do is make sure that the business is appraised of those risks, understands what the potential claims and ramifications can be, so that they are fully aware of the potential consequences in the decision that's been made and how it's being executed.
Yeah. And I mean, we have had a couple of people come through and say that there has been a situation where they've had to deal with something and it has made it into the media, and then they've had to have the fallout of that. I mean, talk me a little bit through about some of the, you know, in a situation where it does land in the media, and is there a kickback on that from a legal perspective in terms of how do you monitor that and how do you help a business control what happens in that environment?
Yeah, so from an employment perspective, I think understanding where that issue has come from. So is it due to a leak by an employee? Is there any misconduct on their behalf in terms of breach of confidentiality or breach of social media policies? So I think that you need to identify first where the source of that has come from, and then deal with any resulting issues from that. But then, you know, liaising with PR teams, and, you know, in terms of how do we actually address this? Is there a statement that needs to be made? You know, any decision like that needs to be done with careful consultation with the business, with the PR team as well. But also, is there any other potential claims? Is there any defamation angles, for example, that you'd need to look at? That would be outside of the remit normally of the HR team, but, you know, working with the legal team and external advisors, you know, on any other potential avenues you can be looking at.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I mean, in terms of policies, actually, because I think that was something that we were also talking about. I mean, policies, having been, I'm actually director of the HR world as well, looking into policies has been an eye-opener actually as well, in terms of, you know, how many you actually need to have. Obviously HR is well known to be the manager of most of the policies within an organisation. So what's the kind of, again, best practice, or what are the problems that you have seen most commonly that people are not you know, crossing the T's, dotting the I's? I mean, are there some very common issues that you come up against when looking at things like social media policies, or, you know, some of the other procedures that people need to have sort of buttoned up before they go into this kind of process?
Yes, I think making sure that you have social media policies and other policies in place, that they are well drafted and very clear and understood, that they're also implemented effectively. So are your employees actually even aware of them? Is it something you taught them through at induction and then they never look at again? Are they easily accessible? You know, how are they actually enforced? Are people reminded about their obligations in respect to policies? So I think that there's a whole piece around the communication of policies to make sure, first of all, that they're very well drafted and do what you need them to do, but also that they are implemented and understood, and that may require training or reminders at certain periods and intervals with your employees, so they really do understand them. In terms of the issues I've seen, often there's no policy, or they've been, you know, there's often an interaction between the employment contract and the policy. So are they incorporated into the employment contract? So if you don't follow your own policy, there's an issue there. You know, how are you requiring employees to comply with them? And if they don't comply with them, you know, what other steps you can take in terms of disciplinary action as well. So it's really about the effective implementation, drafting and enforcement of policies. And I think if you cover all of those three parts well, then you're in a good position in terms of being able to police them.
And that really does highlight the importance of the relationship between HR and internal comms. I think when you see it done well, it's unbelievable how much people understand how the business operates through policy narrative. But when it's done badly, nobody knows where, and it's, you know, they're getting dusty in a metaphorical drawer.
Yes.
An online folder somewhere that nobody knows where to access them. So, I mean, in terms of, I guess, you know, take it, and please do, if anybody's got any questions for Anna, please do ask them now. We are here for another 10 minutes, so please do pop them in the question box. I mean, in terms of, I guess, what you would say from a takeaway perspective, I think there's two issues here for me. One is, I guess, it's almost like business as usual. What are the core things that people really need to have, bottomed out? And then the second is, I guess, in the new world of work, in terms of thinking from a legal perspective and from a reputational perspective, what's got to be central to the strategic thinking around this stuff, to ensure that if really significantly difficult decisions need to be made, especially during quite a short period of time, what do people really need to think about before if the worst should happen?
Yeah, so in terms of proactively planning for that, and the takeaways and what you should be doing, I think first of all, developing a strategy for proactively dealing with decisions from a reputational perspective. So who do you have in place to provide resources and support? For example, PR, have you got anyone internally who deals with that, or externally, who would you need to call on if you need to speak to someone quickly? So I think making sure you have a bit of a crisis management plan in terms of implementation of decisions and who the resources are and the people to sign things off, will be really important to make sure you're making that plan up front. So that's hopefully well developed. You can't always forecast for every situation, but at least if you've got some resources in place and some steps that you can follow, I think that will be very helpful when it comes to the time of implementation. Secondly, I think, as I mentioned, is really staying close to the business and management teams and stakeholders, so you have early involvement in decision making and that you can plan accordingly. Also making sure that you are regularly liaising with line managers so that they understand grievance procedures, whistleblowing procedures, because often they're the eyes and the ears of things that may be brewing within the business that could be leaked on social media, etc. So I think it's really about making sure you've got the right relationships, and we've spoken about having the right relationships with unions as well if you're in a heavily unionized industry as well, which can hopefully help with consultation processes and other decisions that need to be made. I think thirdly, we've touched on already, which is reviewing employment contracts and policies to make sure that they are maintaining confidentiality in terms of confidential information within the business, but also what people can and can't do on social media, what they can say on Glassdoor, for example, so that you have some policies in place to rely on in the event that employees do leak things to the press. Again, another way of dealing with reputational management. I think, actually, if I can add one more, is also making sure you've got the right documentation in place in terms of dismissal processes, so settlement agreements, that they are dealing effectively with non-disparagement and other things, because a lot of issues will happen when people are disgruntled after they leave the business and they do things. So if you are entering into settlement agreements, or it's worthwhile because you're concerned about someone reputationally damaging the business after they leave, then making sure that you've got the right clauses in place in your settlement agreements as well.
That sounds very good advice. And then I guess as well, in terms of that strategic thinking for HR right now, where one of the things we talked about previously actually was also the impact of issues like Brexit longer term, in terms of where potentially businesses might be headquartered in the future because of specific regulations that we have to deal with as a fallout of that. I mean, what do you think are the biggest issues that HR really kind of needs to think about on a longer term? Going on a journey, if you like, with all of the things that are happening in the business environment.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to predict what the biggest issues will be, because they will largely depend on the particular business and how they're impacted. Obviously, we've just been through an extraordinary period of change that businesses have had to deal with, and that's hugely affected employees and how you manage those employees through the process. I think we've seen well-being of employees being really high on the HR agenda over the last few years. But in terms of looking forward and potential decisions that may need to be dealt with by HR teams, we don't know what the effect of the current crisis in Ukraine and Russia could be, the cost of living crisis. It may mean that costs have to go up, and therefore redundancies will need to be made. So again, going back to what I said previously in terms of ensuring you're complying with the right consultation processes, and managing it sensitively and reasonably in terms of implementing those decisions will be really important in terms of protecting risks. But also, if you have systemic issues within a business, for example, potential discrimination, harassment issues that could arise, I think it's dealing with those properly and upfront, not condoning or letting things fester, and engaging with line managers in the event that there are issues. I mean, we've seen diversity and inclusion be, still a very important topic, and one of reputational risk in the event of any claims within businesses as well. We're also seeing, lots of commentary on gender pay gaps. Businesses now taking a proactive approach and doing voluntary ethnicity pay gap reporting, given that the government hasn't implemented that as being mandatory. So, when you are publishing such decisions, thinking about actually what's the narrative, how are you presenting that in a way that's not going to be reputationally harmful to the business and will cast it in the best possible light. So I think that's quite a general answer, but
no, but like you say, it's hard. It is hard to specify, but I think it's also about that proactive piece, actually starting to give your business a positive reputation. It's not just about managing negative. Bad things happen. We know that. It's not that you can't coast through life thinking that it's all going to be rosy, and HR has to manage that on a constant basis, and it's a core part of their job, isn't it? I guess it's about saying how can you best deal with it ahead of time so that you can try and create a positive outcome, either short or long term, for the organisation as a place to work, because ultimately it's all built on people, isn't it? So it's a fairly important part.
Absolutely, and yeah, you're right. There's a whole positive element to this, and the good news stories and how you're presenting those to the market will be really important for attracting new talent, and also how you're dealing with employees internally is very important for retaining talent. So in the tight market we've discussed, that becomes increasingly important. So making sure that the messages that are put out there in terms of employees and cultural issues are really on point, and show the business in the best possible light.
That's why you cannot beat a good communications team, by the way. I mean, I guess, and then for me, it's also, is there a piece around learning and development here? Because it does feel like then we need to catch up on a few things, and because we have all changed, workforces have changed, leadership teams are dealing with things that we never would have imagined, in worst case scenario potentially, but and the fallout from that is we're going to experience that for a long time. I mean, I can't help but feel that there is a huge education piece here in terms of what business looks like from a reputational angle, whether that be communications or legal. And in fact, about 90% of our respondents on our survey have said that they think regular briefings on comms and L&D is essential to business reputation in the future.
Yeah, and making sure that you're engaging on that and thinking about what L&D is needed with your managers and business leaders as well, to make sure that they're equipped with the skills to help deliver the messages. Yeah.
It's a tricky time out there, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But also highly interesting, I think. Exactly. In terms of
keeps us out of trouble. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Anna. Really enjoyed talking that through with you, and looking forward to your next column, which I'm sure will be fantastic, be out later on this month. At the HR World, our next webinar is on May 24th. It is the Metaverse and HR. So we're going to be going boldly where no HR has gone before. And that's with Lloyd Dean and Alexander Lowe, both of whom are experts in the future of work. So please join us, 11 o'clock, 24th of May. And I'm sure we'll be speaking with you again, Anna, in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Good to speak to you all.
Yeah, thanks for attending. Take care. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you again soon.